Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, wherever you are located at the moment. Welcome to the Zoom room of International Relations Department, Universitas Indonesia. Before we move forward, first of all, I would like to ask for your permission to have our meeting today recorded. I hope you all don't mind. But if you feel like you are not happy with that, please just let us know through the chat box. Yeah. In addition, at the moment we are also live at IRE channel in YouTube. Yeah. Today's webinar is one of the lecture sessions of an undergraduate course in our department titled Contemporary Issues in International Relations. Particularly this time, we are focusing on the issues related to global governance. As we might have aware of, for the first time now in the history of IR study, because of the COVID-19 pandemic that has happened for the past 1 year, the structure, mechanism, and pattern of global governance is defined more or less by humanity, by the need of human survival, and by the interest of the people instead of by the interest of the state and market as it was usually before. And my students and I have discussed extensively in our classes, this new phenomenon adds to the complicatedness of global governance. We understand that global governance experiences democratic deficit. We understand that the limitedness of the enforcement of non-state actors in the system. We understand the ever-presence of imbalanced power relations in the actor relations within the system. And with all of that, really, we cannot imagine how this sort of classical framework of international relations that we call global governance could work for the sake of the people at large. So basically, this is the big question that takes us to Professor Shirin M, our guest lecturer for today's session. Professor Ray, or Shirin, if I may, has been criticizing the idea of global governance for more than 20 years now, particularly from the perspective of feminism, a perspective that, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, focuses more on empowerment and emancipation. We would really like to learn in what way global governance is able, or rather unable, to function as a mechanism that empower the people. Yeah. Before we hear from Shirin, allow me first to introduce her. Shirin M is a professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies and the director of Warwick Interdisciplinary Research Center for International Development at University of Warwick, UK. She has written extensively on issues of gender, governance and development, and gender and political institution. Shirin is currently working on the impact of COVID-19 on older people and their carers in Coventry and Leicester. Shirin's recent publications include books titled Performing Representation, published by the Oxford University Press in 2019, and the Oxford University Press Handbook of Politics and Performance that has just been published this month. Congratulations, Shirin. At the moment, Shirin is writing 2 books titled Depletion, The Human Cost of Care, will be published by Oxford University Press, and the second upcoming book is titled Doing Politics Sideways, which will be published by Routledge. In addition to writing books and teachings and facilitating workshops at Warwick, Shirin also served on the editorial boards of several academic journals, including Review of International Studies, International Feminist Journal of Politics, Journal of Narrative Politics, Global Ethics, and 4 other journals. Before we hear from Shirin, allow me to introduce our participant today, Shirin. 18 of the participants are my students, undergraduate students at IR department who takes this course. Some of them are our postgraduate students from IR department. but we also have guests from other universities. Some of them are students, and some of them are lecturers. And we also have representative from Ministries of Women and Child Empowerment, Republic of Indonesia. So it's quite broad, like the differences of of our participants today. And also allow me to explain the rundown a bit. So after this, we will hear from you 30 minutes, if you don't mind. I will tell you when to stop. And then we go through question and answers. We will invite those who wants to ask questions to write in chat box, and then we will invite you to talk directly to Shirin. So I'm not going to read the question, but so all of us can really interact directly with Shirin. And then like 15 minutes before the end, I will invite Shirin to do some wrap up, some conclusion. And then we will have Ibu Dr. Nurul Isnaini as a coordinator of this lecture to say something. This is a very special session before we finish by 11 o'clock in the morning, Shirin's time, and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, our time. So that's basically the rundown. Now I think the floor is yours, Shirin. Thank you.
Thank you, Iris, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. And good afternoon, everyone who is there. It's a real pleasure to support your work, Iris. As we were talking about it today, it was really wonderful to have you at Warwick, and I wish you all the very best in your teaching, and obviously you're doing a fantastic job. So Riris asked me to talk about feminist perspectives on global governance, and as she has pointed out already, that global governance is not a level playing field. It is not a level playing field for many reasons, and I want to very quickly give you some of those. But then obviously, we are all interested in making it more of a level playing field than it is. So then that is where the feminist critiques of global governance, mainstream global governance becomes important, and also expands the concept of global governance itself. So I'll then, in the second part of my talk, I will say a few words about that. So governance, as you all know already, has come to be defined as a system of rules for public life. In this definition, we go beyond the concept of government, which is what, when I was studying, as an undergraduate, that's what we talked about. We talked about the state and we talked about government. But governance includes, of course, multiple actors as well as multiple sites. The state becomes only one of the many sites of governance, including also civil society organizations, international bodies, and businesses. At the heart of the concept, as Rosnau has told us, there is an assumption of a shift in the sources of spheres of authority, and that is the critical element here. Spheres of authority from the state, so the Weberian state that we know so well, which is the kind of monopoly of violence in the state, to these multiple actors and sites. Decolonial authors such as de Souza Santos view governance as the regulatory matrix of neoliberalism, seen as a new version of laissez-faire capitalism. So there you find a kind of already an expansion of and a critique of global governance, seen simply in terms of spheres of authority. What de Souza Santos is, of course, pointing to us is that sphere of authority is also the authority that is underlined by capitalism, and of laissez-faire capitalism in particular, which means that the levels of inequality within this framework are really quite significant. So in this context, the governance paradigm challenges the state as the sole legitimate public authority. The state becomes only one of many institutions that regulate our lives, which make rules which are enforceable, ensure that these rules are accepted and implemented, and that there are penalties attached to breaking these rules, all within the parameters of global capitalist regimes of production, consumption, and exchange. One could argue, therefore, that global governance is a concept that hides as much as it reveals. On the one hand, the shift from government to governance is presented as an explanatory framework seeking to account for global change. And on the other, it is seen as addressing the problem of states' inability to respond to that change. So reviewing the literature on global governance, we find that gender blindness in the mainstream literature skews the analysis towards certain issues, modalities, and methodologies rather than others, which are therefore unable to see alternative modes of thinking about and doing governance. That is really important to emphasize. It's not just thinking about governance or articulating what governance is, but doing governance. And of course, gender is not the only thing that is overlooked. What we also see in terms of political blindness in this literature is race and ethnicity, But today, of course, I will focus on the feminist literature because that's what Radius asked me to do. So global governance literature, as you might already know, has largely analyzed the governance of polities, which is governance of rulemaking in the public sphere, as encompassing three different political arenas. The first is markets. The literature has focused on both markets in goods and services, as well as increasingly markets of knowledge, information technology, patents on knowledge-based products, etc. The volume as well as the volatility of market interactions has been seen to be driving the need to transcend bounded regulation of the state. So things like financial flows across the world and the way in which therefore individual states are able or not able to regulate these, for example. The argument goes that global markets are now too big, the volume of exchange of goods and services too high, and the complexity of interactions, especially in the sphere of finance, too great to be able to be regulated by the state. The linking of local, national, and regional, as well as international markets, has created multiple sites of both production and exchange, which perforce means that the state is unable to exercise its authority over the market processes. But what we don't see very much here is what are the consequences of thinking about the market as a playing field where competition as well as exchange happens. Now, and I will talk about this a bit later, but what feminists would say is markets are not a level playing field. We think about it in terms of choice, we think about it in terms of contract, but what we don't think about is how are these markets embedded in, as Polanyi talked about, in our society, in our social norms, in our gendered social norms, and racialized systems of oppression. So to talk about governance in terms of markets as these regimes of production and exchange only focuses on part of the story. It doesn't focus on the underbelly of markets and how markets are deeply unequal. The second element of global governance theory is the focus on institutions. Of course, that is really important, especially if we are looking at the state destabilizing or decentering rather the institution of the state. So this has included three levels of governance: local, national, sometimes regional and sub-regional, and international. It has focused largely on the ways in which the national state has either been overtaken by or has had to transform itself in response to globalization. Here, the argument is that institutions participating in the regulation of global economy are increasingly of a wide range, which I've already said. So this reflects the complexity of market interactions on the one hand and changing patterns of political actors and their behaviors on the other. Transnational companies as well as transnational movements operate both globally as well as locally, using increasingly sophisticated media for their work, making it difficult for states to always be able to mediate between them or to exercise its authority over them. At the same time, state institutions also participate in refashioning the interaction between institutions and regulations of the economy at different levels. And here, what the feminist critique would be is really that these institutions continue to take the market in the way that I've already articulated, but also that these institutions themselves are gendered institutions. The fact that we have rule-making bodies at the local and at the international as well as national levels, where 50% of the world's, our population, whether it's a national population or a global population, which is women, is so underrepresented, just suggests sort of a deep inequality. Now, does that have consequences? The feminists would say absolutely yes. Is that a parity in representation the only way to address inequalities globally as well as locally? Yes and no, because of course, what we are then sort of reminded of is what De Santos says, that this governance structure is still being underpinned by capitalism, which is so unequal in itself. So it is really important to take institutions seriously, but at the same time, and sort of gendered representation within institutions seriously. But it's also important to understand that these institutions themselves are sort of embedded in and reflective of the social relations within which capitalism creates for us. The third element, and all sort of, that we talk about when we look at global governance issues is that of ideology. Because really, sort of, as I've already indicated, the fact of markets and institutions being embedded is not presented as that their embeddedness is not made visible to us. The reason why we don't see this in clear ways is because of this third element, which is ideology. Which means like ideology which makes certain ideas attain the status of common sense. So if you think back about, well, some of you wouldn't have even been born, but when we think about Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan in the 80s saying, there is no alternative to neoliberal capitalism because of globalization. That is a claim being made that if you disagree with me, you are disagreeing with common sense. If there is no alternative, then we really need to sit down and think, okay, well, this is the framework. Let's try and make this work as best as we can. How the normativity of particular discourses becomes then entrenched as self-evident is the role that ideology plays. It suggests the hegemonic dominance of certain epistemic communities, experts, policy analysts, policymakers, and also university lecturers and intellectuals. So if you think about the work of Edward Said, one of the things he says is that the construction of the other is really a very complex thing, which does mobilize not just colonial histories, but actually travel agents, intellectuals, policy advisors, sort of experts in economy and politics. These are epistemic communities which actually sort of reproduce in universities, in schools, these ideas of what is common sense and what is not. This literature also takes into account how the ontologies of governance, the way sort of, what counts as governance, are promoted through networks of influence and authorities, so through media, of the richer countries, as well as how these are embedded through being embedded in institutionally through international policies, conventions, and treaties. So you can see what is happening here. It's a very complex network that comes into play to reproduce ideologies. And of course, one of the ideologies that is reproduced, feminists would say, is a gender ideology, right? How do we say, oh, women are more caring, so they should have more care roles. Men are not caring, they are much more mobile, therefore. Or we think about sort of, there are certain roles that women can do better, because if I think about the financial crisis in 2008, there were so many examples given about how if it had not been Lehman Brothers, which was the bank that collapsed, that started the crisis, but it had been Lehman's sisters, this crisis would never have happened. This reductionist understanding of that women are risk averse, right? Or that women are more empathetic, so therefore they should be channeled into certain economically professional areas of work. But also at the same time, that ideology somehow says that care, while really critically important, and as we are seeing during this very terrible pandemic, women again are being mobilized to care for, patients in hospitals, children at home because of lockdowns. And people are saying it's kind of, pushing back women's position in society by years, because they are having to give up their jobs to look after kids. All that is wrapped up in an gendered ideology, which on the one hand valorizes care, and on the other hand does not recognize its economic contribution to care. And I'll come back to that in a while. So in my own work, I've also added another dimension of governance of polities in order to understand the interplay between these three arenas of markets, institutions, and ideologies, and to arrive at a more comprehensive picture of how governance is being used in our political vocabulary. And this is the arena of the spectacle. Now, Ridis mentioned this book that I've just edited with my co-editors, the OUP Handbook of Politics and Performance. And if you can read the introduction, at least to that, you'll see where I'm coming from on this. So the idea of spectacle as governance refers to the modes of production of meanings through a display of political power, such that transgressions and disciplining of the other are seen as the exercise of legitimate power. Some cultural norms then become human rights, and others human wrongs. Consent to and legitimacy of dominant relations of power is then produced for us through performances, international summits, military success of shock and awe, participatory modes of politics, both violent and peaceful, at both local and global levels. So think about sort of Greta Thunberg, this young girl and woman now, the performance of her sort of at the UN, berating heads of state. That was a very powerful moment of civil society action. But at the same time, the way in which Trump basically batted her, that whole performance away, and told her not to be silly and go and do her classwork, also showed the way in which because he could have taken seriously what she was saying and engaged with it from an ideological position, but he chose to perform a very different spectacle, which was that of treating her as a child, very badly, even worse, as a child with sort of, some sort of diverse issues, and not paying attention to what she is saying. So those two kind of performances tell us quite a lot about how powerful these performances are in congealing as well as challenging other ideologies and frameworks of markets, institutions, and ideas. So the capturing of these spectacles and their distribution is now carried out through both traditional and new means of communication, the print and electronic media, who circulate images of these spectacles that support the ideologies of power. So that is something that is, of course, now become global. So you will know immediately whether it is Harry and Meghan's sort of interview with Oprah, or it is Greta Thunberg sort of berating people, or you are seeing now the way in which COVID is being represented in the global media. You pick up BBC anywhere, or you look at CNN news anywhere. So the images that you see of what, cremations in India are very different from the images that you would see of COVID pandemic in the UK, where it might be more about PPE and hospitals and sort of, individual stories, which are really powerful, rather than this kind of mass of cremations, which looks so dreadful. So the spectacle is what I'm arguing is that is like really, really important to think about. Hewson and Sinclair ages ago, and I think that still kind of matters, is they have outlined three shifts that have occurred in international relations theory in response to the post-Cold War change, the global change. First, in the work of Rosenau, the shift from, which I've already talked about, authority from state to multiple areas of governance. The second is the work of the UN Commission on Global Governance and the cosmopolitan theorists like Falk and Held, which is the emergence of a global rather than a previously national civil society. And finally, the work of Cox, where they see a review of the work of transnational economic and political elites and coalition of social forces. And this body of work is a rich tapestry of analysis of the changing contours of international system, and it takes us out of the more narrowly focused issue-based analysis of regime theory. But, and I've already said this, that it does not do many other things. These strands of governance theory bring a great deal of sophisticated analysis to bear upon changing nature of state and governance, but they remain gender and race blind. So this is what I want to focus on in the next 10 minutes. Is that okay? Do I have 10 minutes, Riris?
Yes, you have actually 9 minutes.
Sorry?
9 minutes, Shirin.
Mm-hmm. I see, you're a strict chair, very good. So in terms of the way in which feminists have approached this literature is to look at institutional structures and processes. Firstly, by looking at women-centered ways of framing issues. So Mayer and Trugel's work, which involves institutional structures in which women have found or carved out niches for themselves and their interests as women. Do they, though? That's the question I want to put to you. So my earlier question of whether these higher representation of women in institutional structures and processes of global governance, would that lead to a better outcome for women? Second, feminist approaches of global governance through critical gender politics has explored the purposive, goal-oriented social movement strategies to influence international institutions, such as the United Nations and other Bretton Woods institutions. My question there would be, can they? Have they been able to influence these big institutions? And thirdly, feminists have approached gender politics in the context of global governance as, and I quote Mayer and Trugel, contestations of rules and discursive practices in different issue areas. Thus, in analyzing the constitutive parts of governance, a feminist analysis can deepen, historicize, and engender the debates on governance of markets, the changing role of the state, of ideologies of governance, and the governance of spectacles. Now, my answer to the question whether these can be these approaches can be influential, or have they been influential in institutions? I think the answer can only be yes and no. If we look at CEDAW and if we look at SDGs, both of which you are familiar with, I'm sure, what we find is that feminist campaigning on one issue, which is that of care, and how do we recognize, value, and recompense this labor, has had some impact. So as early as CEDAW's coming out of Beijing, they said that was their aspiration, that women's care work should be counted. And we see that now being reflected in SDG 5.4, where the UN says to the states, please account for women's labor in this area of care. So the reason why this shift has occurred is, and the shift has occurred at a global level, not necessarily at a national level, is precisely because of what we have been talking about just now. It is the campaigning, challenging by civil society organizations, by intellectuals, by economists, by networks of influencers, saying, look, this has gone on far too long. We really need to bite this bullet now. And we need to start counting this labor, which we are keeping away. And this, for me, is the critical feminist contribution. We are keeping away from exploring because we make this division between the private and the public spheres. What we find about markets, what we talk about institutions, what we know about ideologies is focused on the public sphere. What is going on in the private sphere, we just shut away. And that, for me, is the key importance of feminist work. Challenging that separation is really, really important. So, for example, in the market system, participants come to specific markets with unequal capabilities and bargaining capacities and resources, as a result of which they inhere in unequal market structures. Take, for example, migration. The fact that some countries facilitate mobility in areas of care, but actually women come to that market already undermined because they cannot just say, okay, that job is not so well paid, I will go elsewhere. Why? Because they have care responsibilities that they cannot move away from. And the market frames gendered labor in different ways, whereby care labor is sort of less valued than and seen to be more naturalized than other labor, such as, for example, manufacturing or finance. So you can now begin to see how these things are connected. But it is more than that, the division between private and public is also important when we think about public policy. Without gender-sensitive indicators, the allocative process cannot be an efficient one. Let's take example of, again, COVID. The fact that our governments never thought that the lockdown, the focus has been on lockdown, furloughs in the UK, which is like people are not going out to work, so therefore we need to support them. Of course they do. But they're not thinking in terms of public policy that the lockdown has also meant children are at home. They are being taught. Who is doing the teaching? What does that mean for the employment opportunities and possibilities for women who are largely responsible? 85% of all work, even in a country like the UK, in terms of child schooling at home, has been done by women. What does that mean in terms of the lengthening of the working day? If you don't count these kind of this work of care as work, what does that mean in terms of the kind of depletion that women face if that work is not counted? It's more than that. It's sort of, the role that this, sorry, let me just also add another thing there, that this division between private and public also sort of overlooks something that a political theorist who wrote a book called The Sexual Contract to talk to the Hobbesian sort of, the social contract. She argued that, Carol Pateman, she argued that actually we talk about a trade-off between sovereignty in the public space, right, with the state. So in terms of protection of the state, so long as you don't take matters into your own hand in the public sphere. But she says there's another trade-off that was going on, and we didn't look at that, or Hobbes definitely did not look at that, which is a trade-off which said to the state, there is gendered sovereignty within the home. It's the male breadwinner who has sovereignty within the home. So let's not look at the domestic sphere, what is happening. It is only very recently that we have even had rape within marriage as a category of harm. It is only fairly recently that women have been given the right to support or have control over their, not control, I don't want to use that word, I'm missing a thing. So if you are divorced, the right to have responsibility for the children rather than the man. It is only relatively recently that the...
Sorry, 2 more minutes, please.
Okay, so the point I'm making here is that the feminists have not only critiqued markets, institutions, and ideologies, they have also looked at this very strong division that is made and which has very strong consequences for different groups of people in our society, and said, look, unless you take this into account, our understanding of governance will be very limited. So let me finish with just a summary of what I've been saying. Feminist scholars and women activists have understood that gender discipline is enforced through economic dependence, political exclusion, and cultural markers of subjugation. Feminists have built their engagements with governance institutions on some key concepts that emerge from women's struggles and scholarship. First, a gendered analysis of political economy and the relations between states and markets. Second, a challenge to the state-reproduced division between public and the private. And third, a commitment to transformation of gender relations that form the basis of formal and informal politics. If we take these insights into account when assessing key areas that we have identified, then global governance will be able to stretch the boundaries of these governance debates to also acknowledge the deep inequalities, which are not just sort of, in terms of class, but also in terms of race and of gender. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Shirin. Thank you. 30-something minutes, but that's okay. We enjoy it so much. Before we go through questions from participants, we already have one already. Kevin, who put his question on chat box, his thesis is on post-colonialism. So you might kind of expect what kind of question he will put forward. But before that, probably please just correct me if I'm wrong, but I want to put your lecture into like a bigger context. I make 4 points here. I take four points here. First, from feminist perspective, global governance is a product of capitalism. Second, from feminist perspective, global governance is a representation of Eurocentrism. Third, global governance from feminist perspective is imposing the logic of liberalism globally. Hence, for us, in this third word, for us who are, here in Indonesia, who are the other of those in the Europe, in the West, for us, global governance is a utopic, and we cannot put our expectation on global governance. What do you think?
Oh, you want me to respond to that? Okay.
Yeah. Probably because I'm wrong on my
no,
notes.
You're not wrong. But where I would start, and of course, because it was such a quick wraparound in terms of the debates, one thing that I should have said at the start, and I did not, is that, of course, we are not talking about feminism, we are talking about feminisms, right? There is liberal feminisms, there is Marxist feminism, there is post-colonial feminism, and anything in between, just like with any other theoretical framing. So, but I think that there is a consensus, consensus on analysis, not so much on what to do about it. And that is the question that Kevin has put, I think, what to do about it. That yes, neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalism is a big issue, as you have just said. There is less attention paid on Eurocentrism by some feminists, liberal feminists, for example, more universalist understandings of rights, more universalist understanding of human rights in particular, of choice, of representation in political institutions. So Eurocentrism, some feminists would be really focused on post-colonial, decolonial. Some Marxist feminists would be really focused on that. Liberal feminists would sort of see that not as a problem, right? Yeah. They would be focused more on democratic institutions, democratizing the public space, having quotas for women to participate in institutions. And those are really important things. So that's the first thing I would say. So you're not wrong, but it is a more complex picture even then.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Shirin. Now I would like to invite Kevin. Kevin, are you there?
Yes, Mbak Riris. Hello.
Hello, Kevin. You can talk directly to Shirin now.
Okay, thank you, Mbak Riris. Good afternoon, my time, Professor Rai. Uh, thank you very much for your presentation. So I was thinking that you raised a very important issue about the normalization of discourse. So my question would be, what can we do about it? Do we delink ourselves from it, or do we challenge the discourse from within, or we can do both at the same time? So that's my question.
That's a
Thank you very much.
really good question and a very hard one. I think what you have said towards the end is exactly right. So this was a very old paper of mine in which I argued it was about the state. And I argued that we need to think about challenging the state both from, inside and outside, in and against the state. This was about feminist legal struggles in India. And the reason why we need both, and that is the hard bit, right? So this is why, while I say there are feminisms, but it is also true that we need the kind of political strategies of institutional feminism as well as civil society feminism, right? Now, let's take an example. If you have more women in a political institution, whether it's local or national, what we have found, and there's been a lot of feminist work done on that from different perspectives, that this does change two things. The first is women largely focus on, because of their gendered construction, they focus more on issues around health, education, so what we would call care, right? There has been a lot of economists like Esther Duflo, who's just got the Nobel Prize. Her work on India suggested that ages ago. The second thing that changes and can change is that institutions themselves can become more gender sensitive. So my work, this book that I did on the Indian Parliament, suggested that the problem is in the Indian Parliament is not that women don't get time to speak, which they also don't, but it is that the Parliament itself remains a gendered institution because women are so few. So women have to negotiate really very difficult terrain. But if you look at some other parliaments like Rwanda, where you've got 56% women in parliament, that institution becomes more feminized, right? So this is what's called critical mass, right? There is a critical mass. That is why we say quotas should be about 30%. Because 30% is a big enough number that women can start making, or if it is a quota for sort of, ethnic minorities in the UK or sort of Black and ethnic minorities. So that's one thing. The other underpinning thing that you have pointed out is that despite these two changes, what we are also functioning within is global capitalism. Now, do we have evidence that women in parliament are more radical in regulating capitalist flows, financial flows, for example? The evidence is not so, because there is the question that you link to the politics of women. So I always say that my concern is the injustice, the structural injustice of keeping people out of institutions of global governance which make policy. It is unjust because if you say you are a representative body and you are being so unrepresentative in your membership, and structurally so that, a long history of representation shows how few women end up in parliament, then there is a problem there that we need to address. I do not want to focus on the women-centeredness of women are more empathetic, No, Margaret Thatcher was not more empathetic, right? Or Indira Gandhi was not more empathetic, or sort of, Golda Meir was not more empathetic. Yes, some women can be. Some women can be much more radical, but others not. But that still does not mean that they should not have presence in our parliaments, right? So that's where your sort of summing of the two. On the one hand, we want to be in there making the argument, at least for sort of, health and education and care. And at the same time, holding those women who are on the inside accountable by having campaigns on the outside which say, why are you not taking up these issues? And together, you can do much more than if you focus only on one rather than the other. Having said all that, I think the point that DeSantos makes is an important one, which is that we don't see any reduction in the power of neoliberal capitalism. And unless that happens, it is very difficult for these institutions to be able to mitigate the worst excesses of. What happens, what we are seeing is that because of the globality of it all, we are seeing the movement of labor go, or even if you think about rights of labor, go from one part of the world to another, to be depressed, to be paid badly, to have, the race to the bottom and globalization, which I'm sure you have all listened to. So I think it's a very complex picture, but you point out something really important. So thank you for that, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Professor Rai.
Yeah, thank you. Kevin, you want to follow it up? Or
If I may?
Yeah.
Okay. Professor Rai, thank you very much for your answer. I was thinking when you were answering, if we need both sides to be there, from the within and from the without, how to make sure that the women or the oppressed group in the inside do not participate in the perpetuation of the oppression. Because, for example, in Indonesia, women are put into parliament, but what kind of women are put in the parliament? They are, if I may, capitalists, those who have capital to do just that. They have links to environmental exploitations, for example. So oppression within the oppressed group is perpetuated by those in the inside, even though they are from the same oppressed group. So how do you think we can stop this from happening?
Only from the outside, right? Only from the outside. You have to have these campaigns. You cannot expect, that's what I was saying. So if I'm a paid up member of the Conservative Party in the UK, then my politics is that of my party. So when I was working on women in India, there was a huge spectrum. The government in India just now is absolutely, in my opinion, dreadful. What they're doing, and even their gendered understanding of politics, is so far from what sort of I believe in. And yet in Parliament, there were other women who are from, say, Congress Party, which is centrist. There are women from the Communist Party who are left. Their ideas don't match, right? But some areas, they work together. So domestic violence, for example. Everyone can say domestic violence is terrible. But when it comes to structural issues that you are raising about sort of, neoliberalism. So if we think about austerity or cutbacks to the state under structural adjustment policies, you would see that women kind of vote with their parties, right? Rather than vote with their conscience. But the point about that is they vote with their parties because they believe in their party ideology, right? They're not voting just because, they believe that markets are the best form of exchange. They believe that choice should be given to everybody in the market, not elsewhere, in the market. They believe in that division between the private and the public. We should take that seriously. They're not just women. They are actually political actors, right? So when we when we think about men in Indonesian politics, we don't ask them the same questions, do we? We don't say, you are a man, why are you not acting in the interests of men? We accept more care because of that normalization, that men have always been dominant in the public politics. So what I make a distinction is the governance of polities is very different from the governance of communities. And communities are also deeply divided communities, right? Communities are also gendered. So just to say, oh, we must mobilize outside, it's not easy there again. I don't know enough about, sadly, about what's happening on the ground in Indonesia, but at least in India, I wouldn't say, or even in the UK, that communities are deeply gendered institutions. Right? So I did a piece of work on honor crimes, so-called honor crimes in India and Pakistan, in which we found all these elements of that governance that I've talked about: markets, institutions, ideologies, spectacle, present in the way in which honor crimes regulated the community with community sanction. Right? To generate a politics of hate against the other. So let's not, Eurocentrism is really important and we need to think about it, but Eurocentrism is also reflected in our own locals, in the context of India on the caste system. I don't know, there'll be equivalents in Indonesia, I'm sure. So I think that it is really a complex terrain to think about, but think about it politically, to denormalize certain aspects of the way in which we think about women participating in politics.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Okay, Kevin, enough, yeah?
Yeah,
I know
enough.
so many things spiraling in his mind at the moment, I'm sure, but sorry, Kevin, time is up for you.
Well, write to me if you want to. It'll be nice.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, thank you. So next question sent to me privately is from Juan. Juan Antonio is one of our undergraduate students. Juan, are you there?
Still writing the second questions, but yeah, I'm here.
So Juan is another post-positivist scholar. Now he's focusing, his interest is on religion or Islam in IR. So let's see what the question is. Silakan Juan, be my guest.
Well, apparently my question is not related to Islam in any way. Well, it is interesting point that you've been mentioned that certain tradition and norms had been intentionally normalized to be human rights, whilst the rest deemed as human wrongs. Well, my question is, you've been noted that this practice should be questioned also, as these matters are subject to each community experience and context, or what Acharya called as cognitive prior. Now, does this also apply to what feminisms and had been advocating for? That perhaps what we deemed as inequality is not inherently bad, since it was also come from Western/European conception, historical experience, and so on and so forth.
Sorry, Juan, can you repeat the last bit, because I couldn't hear it very well?
Okay. What shall I repeat this?
Sorry.
Yeah. Does what feminisms had been advocating for also subject to this scrutinize, to this scrutiny?
sorry,
You mean
Well,
discrimination?
I will.
Subject to, sorry, what discrimination did you say?
Scrutinize.
Scrutinize.
Scrutinize, yes.
Scrutinize.
So our feminisms, sorry, you'll have to start again. Sorry, so
Okay.
yeah.
Wait.
What is the question?
I'll post it by in the chat box, since
Okay.
I think I have bad English pronunciation. Yes.
No. It's just, I think sometimes it crackles, and I think Kevin's was quite clear, but just now it's crackling a little bit. So
It is. Wait.
So first thing I would say is that they've not been intentionally normalized. That's the whole point. It is that they are normalized to be human rights what others deem that human wrongs. Yeah, this practice should be questioned as matters subject to each community experience and context. What Acharya has called cognitive prior. Now, does this also apply to what feminisms have been advocating for? That perhaps what we deemed as inequality is not inherently bad, since it was also come from Western European. Well, I mean, I don't think that inequality is inherently bad. It depends on how you talk about inequality. So Marx, for example, said I think in Capital Volume 1, that to be equal, you have to be unequal, right? If you think about it, somebody is disabled, it's sort of, differently abled. We give more resources to make sure, like think about Warwick University campus, which Aurelius knows quite well. Before the campaigns that disability groups started, the university campus looked very different from what it looks like now. There were no lifts. There were no ramps for wheelchairs. There were no separate entrances that were more convenient for people, wheelchair users. So, and the university has spent a lot of money, which somebody could say is really unequal because there are very few disabled students in the university compared to other students, right? So inequality inherently, you could say, when we talk about affirmative action, that is the problem, right, for liberals and libertarians, because they would say, why should anyone be given special dispensations, whether it is in terms of education or representation? There shouldn't be a quota, there shouldn't be affirmative. What we want is a meritocracy. Well, all the work of Piketty shows how inequality is reproduced through wealth. So if you are going to challenge certain groups being in charge or in power, then you need to be maybe unequal in your support for those who are just now marginalized. So the question is not so much about whether inequality is inherently bad. The question is which inequalities, how those inequalities are reproduced, and what are the consequences of those inequalities being exercised. So in the case of disability, unequal resource allocation within a university to change the way the university kind of addresses issues of mobility has a good consequence. It has a good outcome for everybody. All of us now have, so it could be that it started as a push for ramps because of wheelchairs, but actually, if I'm elderly or if I have hurt myself and can't go upstairs, it's good for me too. I can now use those ramps rather than going upstairs in a difficult way or using lifts. So the point I'm making is that which inequalities, and that was what I was also saying to Kevin, is there a systematic structural inequality that disallows people from participating in public life, right? If, for example, we look at race laws in the United States before, it was only in the 60s, they couldn't vote, right? If I look at Dalits in India, who are beaten up regularly or even lynched because of caste inequalities. Now, those structural inequalities are something that we need to change. And I won't say, oh, well, that's just cultural caste. Let's just continue with that. But there are some inequalities of resource allocation, which can be very different. So we need to be very clear, just like I was saying to Kevin, as to what it is that you are talking about. How are you talking about those? From which political perspective are you talking about this? So I don't know whether that answers your question or not, but you also say, I want to ask about the meaning of oppression and its linkage with emancipation. You've got very good students, Riris. Certain marginal group we must relate with and speak using their language to ensure that we are not liberating from certain condition imposed on them. Then how does feminism ensure that what they have been advocating is really emancipating? I think that is a question not just for feminism. I think it's a question for those who campaign on issues of race, those who campaign on issues of class. You are quite right. It's again going back to, it's a different form, a discursive form of what Kevin was talking about. That in order for oppression, sort of to talk in the language of emancipation, you need two things, right? One is to be able to speak in the language of the oppressor. You need to speak to them, not in the language of, but you need to speak to them. Now, in a globalized world today, and because of histories of colonialism, at the international governance level, sadly, Bhasa is not the language we speak, right? Hindi is not the language we speak. We all speak English. Even the French have started speaking English, which is amazing. I never thought they would. Because of course, there's also the colonial history of Francophone Africa to take into account.
If I may add, Shirin, when we talk about language, we don't really, for example, when we speak English, we don't really just use English words to express ourselves, but we are imposed to think in an English way, because language have rational, language have logic, right? Right. So we, the way we structure our sentence, for example, like it or not, we are asked to follow the logic of, to follow the English logic. So how then, sorry, Juan, but we discussed a lot. I cannot understand what you have in mind. I'm sorry. But how can we speak to them using their language, but really expressing ourselves? How can it be possible?
Yeah. So I don't know whether you've read Gayatri Spivak's piece on Can the Subaltern Speak, right? And in that, she kind of is also making reference to this. Can the subaltern ever speak? Or can they always be spoken for, right? It's that representation question. And when we are spoken for, you are quite right. Whether it is from our own elites, right? All of you, I count as part of the elite. You are highly educated, you speak good English, you sort of are able to understand concepts which are sort of, globalized concepts. But you are right, those globalized concepts and the English language structures what we speak and what we do not speak. And it's not just English, but it's also a masculinized language. So when we think about using certain words, I still say to my students, this is not academic language. Why? Because they use very emotional words. And then I have to check myself and say, emotion is okay. Emotion is good to be part of. Why? Because of another division, another binary that feminists have been arguing against, which is not just the private and the public, but the rational and the natural, which is also a gendered division, right? So rational language, rational argument, emotion out, right? So how it's not just English and the structure of English, which of course it is important to acknowledge, but it's also that the language itself and this idea of rationality that you need to, if you want to, so going back to Joanne's question, how do we speak to the oppressor? If you talk, this is where it connects with ideology, as I was saying, and normalization, because if you say to somebody that these capitalist social relations are dreadful and we should not have austerity, the government is not the same as household, you can borrow much, you should not only invest in infrastructure projects, but social infrastructure projects, they will just look at you either puzzled or roll their eyes and say, but that is just not common sense, what you are saying. So we are back to that sense of what is normalized and what is not, and how we use that language. So then it takes me back to the issue of its linkage. What you raise is about emancipation. And also, I think Kevin talked about delinking. Can we delink from the vocabulary and the epistemology of oppression? I think to some extent, we have to, right? So the fact that language wars have become border wars is kind of really important to understand. It is not just marginal political issue that we say, we do not say one sort of, certain words now, which were common currency, right? We are very careful now about saying he or she when we could say they. This is like the latest. I'm learning from my students that LGBTQI people need to have, we need to be, and trans people, we need to be attentive to their identification. So at one level, emancipation means that we are attentive to those things, that we do delink from the earlier modes of communication. At the same time, our language is also historically embedded. It will take us a long time. So I remember the first time my children used the word sick. Oh, that's really sick. And I said, what's sick about it? I think that's really good. Yeah, we mean sick is good, Ma. Just that's just, that's a generational shift, which I am not. I have to learn because sort of, slang is always something the previous generation is behind, right? But slang is also political because it is carving out a space for the younger generation to speak to each other. It's that moment of delinking before us grown-ups kind of then say, oh, now I know that sick means good. What a crazy world. But it is, so it's important for communication and carving out new spaces of communication and how we communicate. And that's part of emancipation. But emancipation can be studied at different levels. And what I would say is that unless we connect the dots between discourse and the political economy of our worlds, it's like saying, feminists have till recently not been very good at focusing on the environment, even though they have focused on the care of their homes, Now you have to connect the dots, because if we don't connect that dot between care and planetary care, human care and planetary care, we all would not be around very long. Look at what's happening in Indonesian forests. Look at what's happening in the mining in South Africa. Look at what's happening in the rainforest in Brazil. Unless we are able to expand our vocabularies, and that comes with its own political history and political legacy. So emancipation also has to mean joining these dots of political economy, of discourse, of political institutions, without which I personally don't think that, that we will be able to advocate for emancipation in the way that you want.
Wow. Okay, thank you, Shirin. Enough for now, yeah, Juan? Yeah. I remember, when you mentioned about sick, I remember, I think it was like our first 2 months in Coventry, a couple of years ago. I took my son for his first trial session at his football club. Right. So at the end of the trial session, we have some obviously the coach, we gathered and listened to the coach, and then some of the kids tell my sons, "Al, you are sick. Al, you are sick." And then I was, oh, what did my son do wrong? Why his friends? And then I said, what did you do wrong? On the way to car, no, they said that I'm good, but they said that you are sick, so that this generation gap, political mindset gap, cultural gap, everything.
But it's also,
so that's
it is also important. I'm really fascinated that you told this story, because I'm now seeing how quickly this language and this sort of slang is globalized.
Yeah.
When I was growing up in India, it took us a long time to catch up. And by that time, sort of, through Hollywood films, which would be shown at long distances, there wasn't the kind of flow of information and cultural language so fast. Like all young people today are speaking in very similar ways across, even though they are sort of, like we always call English Hinglish in India, because English is like, sort of vernacularizing English with certain things, but it is really globalizing very quickly. So that was a good example that to think about.
Especially during this pandemic, when kids have more time at home, they have access to YouTube, they have access to Netflix. My niece and nephews, they just take English as serious. I mean, the context. So if you are wrong, you say this, without they really know, like word by word. So yes, very interesting. So we have next questions. Again, it's a direct message from Nisha. She's very humble. She said, "Please, please read my question first. If you think that it is good enough, I will ask the question." So she's not very confident, but she's again one of my best students. She's writing her thesis on LGBT. So Nisha, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, floor is yours.
Thank you, Marinis, and hello, Professor Rai. My name is Nisha, and I have been tuning into your lecture, and I think it is also related to the previous question, because you talk a tiny wee bit about LGBT and how it has been talked about in politics. But then I believe in the class we have always been talking about how feminism used to be very exclusive, and then after that, that's why we have women in color feminism. That's why we talk about it. And then they also talk about transgender in their conversation too. But then I do think, though, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think that they're able to talk about LGBTQ, and they can talk about transgender rights and all that kind of thing, because they talk about it in the same manner that this issue is inequality issue. But then the problem is, from what Juan said previously, like we have different kind of definition when it comes to inequality. When we talk about inequality in the EU, we talk about gender inequality as it is. But then, because my thesis is about LGBT in Indonesia and how tradition and norms can define human rights and human wrongs, my question is how could feminism itself bridge the gap between the tradition and norms that shape the politics, the conversation in a country, and then the conversation about inequality itself? Because in Indonesia, when we talk about LGBTQ, it's not only about equality, it's also about religious views, also about religious norms, and it's also about tradition and local norms. So it's kind of like a tiny bit of a tanglement over there. So how could feminism untangle that conversation itself? Thank you.
What a wonderful question. I think you guys are really great. I'm loving this conversation. So you're quite right that if we take the feminist struggle for recognition, that should help, right? That should help feminism to be a bridge between heteronormative discourses and a much more varied understanding of gender and varied understanding of sexuality. And I think there are certain strands of feminism that would do that, right? And they are doing it. So a lot of my friends and colleagues who are feminists, who work on LGBTQI sort of issues, they would make that connection very strongly, that you cannot understand oppression, exploitation, inequalities without sort of addressing other inequalities, other sort of oppressions, and other forms of marginalization. So they do make that. And they also, some of them, for example, if you're interested in that, my colleague Kate Bedford has done some really interesting work on this about masculinities and how they are also constructed in gendered ways, right? It's not just femininities constructed in gendered ways, but masculinities are constructed in gendered ways. And what pressures do they put? And if we want both men and women to be emancipated, not just women to be emancipated, both men and women to be emancipated, then we do need to look at the policies of the World Bank in Latin America, which is what she was writing about at the time, in order to understand that how these marginalizations and oppressions are important for capitalism, right? Because they allow the hyper exploitation of certain groups. And at the same time, maybe improving qualities of, because, you know, it's like what Marx again wrote about the reserve army of labor, which is women's labor. You know, you mobilize it in moments of crisis, like it is happening now, and then you push it back into the domestic sphere. So the domestic sphere is really convenient for capitalism. But the alternate side of that is that actually capitalism can actually live with identity politics easily, right? They can have, I mean, okay, so just now, LGBT community in Indonesia might be facing a lot of problems because of the local conditions that but as they were in the UK, as they were in the US, right? So there's been a wonderful show that they have had called, what was it? It's all about AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. And it is beautiful because it shows how nobody cared, because it was seen to be an LGBT problem. Let's not invest in it. Let's not care about it. Once it started sort of being seen as also a heterosexual problem, then there was this investment, right? Or we have seen in Ebola sort of pandemic that actually erectile dysfunction actually has most investment in the pharma industry, right? In terms of trying to find new ways of addressing that problem, which is a very serious problem. Not Ebola, not other, which are affecting global South countries and poor people in global South countries. The point I'm making is that marginalization has very serious consequences, but capitalism actually can accommodate identity politics. It cannot accommodate so much these other economic shifts, right? So many feminists have argued that feminism is a good bridge, just like what you are saying, is a good bridge to address these. But some feminists would treat it as an identity issue, which is also important. I'm not saying it's not important. Some would be treating it as a political economy issue. Others would be, as liberal feminists, would be treating it as an equal rights issue, right? So they will not be, so, you know, what they will be saying, and you might say, well, actually just now in Indonesia, that is really important that we get equal rights of marriage. I mean, I personally felt that when the LGBT community here in the UK started being so focused on getting marriage rights, I was thinking like, but marriage is, feminists have always said marriage is an oppressive institution. Why do you want to buy into this, right? But then I get it also, like if others are getting married and if we believe in marriage, we want to get married as two women or two men or two trans people, we should be allowed to. That's an equality of rights issue, right? Does that address, and that also feminists would say, well, feminism has a long history of equal rights struggles, right? All the way from the suffragettes before that, sort of, you know, in struggles of nationalism, right, in colonial states, of seeking equal constitutional presence, equal fundamental rights, right? So long history. So we should be able to mobilize that and say to our LGBTQ colleagues that, yes, that is a good bridge between us. But getting a right in itself is not enough, is it? There will still be poor people who are LGBT, much more vulnerable, much more sort of open to, at least that's what I find in India, abuse, than people who are rich, whose parents are professional, whose, and they all talk about, you know, like, oh, my hairdresser, he's LGBT. And there is no, in Delhi, there is, I don't hear that kind of local sort of pushback against LGBTQ rights. But at the local level in villages and small towns, you do. So you need the rights, but you also need a system whereby those rights can protect everybody across class boundaries. So that's where we come to, which we haven't talked about yet, is intersectional politics. Feminism allows us into an intersectional politics. You are quite right. And that intersectional politics means that we need to think about these in the framing of class, in framing of global South, race, ethnicity, and LGBT all together. Can you believe that? That is just crazy. But at the local level, that formulates very differently intersectionality. It might not be race, it might be caste in India, right? It may not be caste in Indonesia, it could be religion, right? Or religion in India as well. India's got all the problems, really. But so we need an intersectional analysis, which feminism does allow us. But different feminists do it differently. So you'll have to choose.
Okay. Do you want to follow it up, Nisha, or enough for now?
I think it's enough for now, but I would like to point out that it's quite unique, the situation with LGBT in Indonesia, if I may say so myself, because you talk about the LGBT in India and how it's the people, the LGBT group who happen to be rich are untouchable, but that in Indonesia, the trans people, they're okay. Like, even though they're not happen to be rich, we are okay with them. But then the moment we talk about the rights, the moment we talk about, okay, we allow you to live like we do, like heterosexual do, we become those people who hate them. So they're very open about it. We have Banji, we have so many people that happen to be not rich, but then they're untouchable in a way that they're welcome in our society. But then the moment we talk about it and we bring this issue to the politics, it becomes something that we have to demonize in a way.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
That's
that's really interesting. So what is fascinating is that even though I said that about Delhi, it was also true that till 2 years ago, homosexuality was still criminalized under colonial law. Right? The same colonial law continued, and it does in so many different ways. Colonial law has found its way into post-colonial constitution and legal regimes. So we still had to struggle for getting that clause removed from the constitution. And it was only 2 years ago that it was. So the struggle about rights is a very serious struggle, because what rights do, there's a very beautiful book which you could read, it's an old book now, by Patricia Williams, called The Alchemy of Race and Rights. And in that she argues that marginalized people like Blacks in America, which is what she is writing about, for them, law is oppressive, but law also provides sometimes a baseline which we can struggle over, right? If, for example, you and I have the same rights across the color line in the US, then violation of, think about the BLM movement, right? Think about the BLM movement. Now, the fact that you can have that movement also presupposes a constitution that guarantees equal rights to everybody. And then we can say, no, it doesn't, right? Or we can say, if there is a minimum wage legislation, then we can say, well, there may be a minimum wage, but people are not dealing with it, right? So they are not giving us minimum wage. We want, or we can say, the minimum wage that you've given us is too little. You cannot survive on that. So you can have battles. And that's what Patricia Williams was saying, that formality, because the rich are the ones, the powerful are the ones, because of the normalization of their ideas, their language, their discourses, they are the ones who benefit most from informality.
Yeah. Wow.
Right? So have a read of that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shirin. Thank you, Nisha, for the question. So next we have Audrey. Audrey is our student in this particular course. Again, she's not sure about whether the question is good enough, but I think, but I say just go ahead. Okay, Audrey, are you there?
Yes, I am. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity. Hello, Professor. My name is Audrey, and as Marita stated, I'm an undergraduate here in IRB. I have to admit that my question is pretty simple compared to previous questions, as I believe that this is a very new realm of knowledge to me, but I am very much curious about one part of your presentation. You stated that regarding the migration section, care-oriented jobs are undervalued compared to jobs that are more manly or patriarchal in a sense. Therefore, this makes women migrants, they have a harder time fighting for their welfare and their livelihoods. However, I was wondering, has the care-oriented sector, driven by the rise of demands for the nursing and caregiving industry, has COVID-19 and the pandemic helped feminists promote their agenda in demanding more value and more attention towards women-heavy job sectors? I hope that that's understandable. Thank you.
No, that's a really good question. And I think it's a very timely question, given what you say about COVID, which is what I was trying to say. So what we find globally is that there is what we call a gender division of labor in the labor market. So that's what I was saying. Markets are gendered. Markets are sort of, embedded in gender relations. And that is reflected in which jobs are women concentrated in and which jobs. And that, going back to our discussion about languages and language, the language of physics and chemistry and mathematics is seen to be, or was seen to be till very, very recently, a language that men were more sort of, in tune with. While the languages, as in languages, sort of learning French or English or Bhasa or Hindi, that women were somehow better at that. Similarly, men were seen to be, so my PhD student, and actually Riris, did Juanita teach you?
Juanita is actually my supervisor.
So I was Juanita's supervisor, and she did her
Juanita Elias, right?
She did a very good PhD, in which one of the things that I've never forgotten, when she came back from her fieldwork, she said that she went and interviewed people in a factory, a garment factory, in which she asked the manager as to why all the sewers were women and all the foremen were men, right? And he was like really puzzled. He said, of course they are, because men cannot sit still for 2 minutes. So they have to move around, and women they are much more compliant. And so they are much better at. But of course, we also know that women are seen to be not needing any skills development for sewing, because that is something that comes naturally to them as part of the care package. So the gender division of labor is really reproduced through the ideology of gender. It is institutionalized through management structures, and it has economic market consequences, because of course, where you don't see sort of, value added in terms of skills development, that is also a job that is natural, and therefore it doesn't need much investment, therefore it is lower in wage. So while we see, and I don't know, I would be really curious to hear from you about what the situation is in Indonesia, but as political economists, global political economists, we kind of think about the flows of migration from Philippines, right? Loads of Filipina women were facilitated by the Filipina state to migrate for remittances. Loads of men from India go to the Gulf to work as construction workers. They earn much more, and they leave behind a family. The issues around who migrates and at what cost are not just about wages, not just about gender division of labor. It's also about how long the working day is for the person. So the man who goes to the Gulf, it's dreadful conditions, as you can see during the football, the World Cup coming up in Qatar, and how there have been awful reports about the way these men have been treated. So many have died because of poor treatment and working in the heat. But nobody is telling us very much about how women are being affected when now, thanks to technology, they go from Philippines to New York to look after other children while their own children are at home. Well, how are they managing all that? They're doing it through WhatsApp, they're doing it through Skype, they are managing their children's education. So the working day is so lengthened. And yet we are not looking at those issues at all, And if you look at COVID, I mean, the reason why, though men initially, it was talked about that men got COVID more, but the fact remains that actually women are more women are nurses in hospital than men are. So the deaths have been quite significant, especially where COVID has not been taken seriously, or where PPE, the private, personal, personal protective, whatever, has not been given to them. In the UK, we had a very strange experience recently. In the first wave of the pandemic, we all stood outside our homes and clapped our nurses. Every Thursday we used to clap, and it was a big moment of sort of showing solidarity with them, but also ourselves, really. And yet the government has just now announced that they will be giving only 1% increase in their income going forward, despite the long hours of work that they are giving. So there's this whole discrepancy about how care work is being treated, right? And how care work is seen as gendered. And I have written quite a lot about this in my other work, which is to say that this has got direct and causal harms, which are harms to both individuals, households, and communities. And migration is one way of thinking through some of these harms. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Audrey, for the question. And Shirin, I know it is now about time. If I'm being like really strict with my own schedule, it's now about time for you to for the concluding remark. But I have one more question, and it comes from Humam. You know, the one who arranged everything to make this happen, and I will feel really bad if I don't give opportunity for him to ask the question. So can we give some time for Humam, Shirin? Okay, yes, Humam, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mariris. Good afternoon, Prof. Riris. My name is Umam. I'm also an undergraduate student from IR in University of Indonesia. Actually, my question is somehow related to many questions previously, perhaps related to the gap I see in Indonesia between those who knows about feminism and those who doesn't know about who don't know about feminism. And somehow I think those gap is pretty important in policy making in our legislative body. So as you have mentioned previously also that feminist thinkers and activists have done a lot to bring change to governance, such as things that happen in UK or America. What do you think should feminist thinkers or activists do now, focus for improving the current state of governance in terms of gender relations, so that those who don't understand or those who do not have the access, do not have the opportunity to learn, the common people who live in the rural village can be helped by the ideas. That's it.
That is a question I think I should ask you. What do you think you should be doing? Because of course that makes a difference, you know, context makes a difference, doesn't it? There's a feminist slogan called "Context is all." Because if I was to say to you, you know, do this, you will tell me quite rightly that in Indonesia, I cannot do this because of A, B, and C, right? But I think all of us can also, I'm thinking about Nisha's question, I'm thinking about Joan's question and Kevin's question. We can all agree on some things, right? A, that even though I might have differences with liberal feminism, rights matter. So can we think about, in the Indonesian context, equal sort of discourse of rights? Can we? I don't know. This is a question to you, right? So that LGBTQ community in Indonesia feels as safe as men do. Secondly, we need to think about, I think, representation. Again, a liberal feminist approach. Are we happy with the fact that we have, and again, what is the representative, what's the gender representation in your parliament? Do you know anybody?
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it is about 30%, if I'm wrong, 30 or 20%.
30%?
Yeah, if I'm not
it is
mistaken.
mandated by the regulations, at
I
least
see.
30%. Yes.
Oh, good. So then going back to Kevin's question, what is the relationship between your parliament and those outside and civil society, right? So we need to examine that and say, how do we hold our MPs accountable, whether they are women or men, in challenging inequalities? So that is something, and not only in parliament, but also at the local level, which is much more difficult. You know, everybody valorizes, they say, oh, local politics were wonderful. I just feel that's where Eurocentrism also becomes a problem, because I find sometimes that women, when I was interviewing MPs in parliament in India, they said it is much easier to make change at the national level than at the local level, where the hierarchy, gendered hierarchies and caste hierarchies are so close to people's everyday life that it is so hard. You are under so much surveillance and violence is direct. So there's that. But I think the main thing for me just now would be to think about the challenging this division between private and public in the sphere of work. That is what is really bothering me, that after so many decades now, Marilyn Waring wrote a book called If Women Counted in 1988, in which she was a UN statistician. She made the case that actually by leaving out women's care work in the domestic sphere, unpaid care work, we are also leaving out our concerns for women's emancipation. That was 1988, and we still don't have it. We still calculate our GDP. All countries have to, and that's a global governance mechanism. They all have to calculate the GDP in the same way, which includes crime, but it does not include domestic unpaid care work. Now, you might say, well, how does that matter? It matters in several ways. Women feel that they are not contributors. Policymakers feel they are not contributors. So look what is happening, at least across the global south. States are saying, let's mobilize more women into the labor market without paying any attention to what goes on in the home, creating double and triple burdens for women, which lead to direct harms of citizenship, as well as direct harms of health for women, right? So I think those are the three areas that I would be looking at. So we need to change this view that somehow the domestic has got nothing to do with, we have done so in many ways in the political sphere, in political rights argument, right? So we do not think now that, you know, we don't need a law against domestic violence. We think we do, even though it is happening in the domestic sphere. We have changed laws around divorce so that it can be, both parties can divorce, or like in India just now, the really Hindu nationalist government has said, oh, well, you know, triple talaq is out now and you have to have divorce. So we have actually made interference in all sorts of ways, but not in the way in which women's work is valued. Until that is done, I think that, so that would be what I say. You need to tell me what would work in Indonesia.
Okay, Prof. Shirin, thank you for the answer.
Okay, thank you, Humam. So I would like now to invite Shirin for some concluding remarks, probably going back to our first question at the very beginning, like whether actually global governance can be an alternative to empower those who are the other in general.
Well, as Foucault said, you know, where there is power, there's resistance. and empowerment is one element of empowerment is solidarity to resist. And so I think it's not that global governance discourses or global governance policies or global governance institutions can help us. No, but in making in pushing back against the inequalities of global governance, we can also develop, I think, new ways of global solidarity, not the kind of global sisterhood that first world feminists tried to make in the 1960s, but a global solidarity which connects the kind of dots that we have been talking about. So I don't really have very much more to say. It is only, I think, my focus is on the next generation and how you interpret so many of these debates, which are very complex, but very necessary. So I'm just looking to Kevin, to Juan, to Nisha, to Humam, to Audrey for answers. I'm not giving you any on that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shirin. So I would like to invite everyone. Together we give applause for Shirin for the lecture. Thank you so much. And before I give the floor to Ibu Nurul, probably now we can have a picture together. No, we are Asian, Southeast Asian. We love to take picture, so we need to take picture. Okay, Ivan, can you help taking picture for us?
Yes. Yes, everyone.
Okay, everyone,
Could
please
you
turn on the
off
camera, please.
please, so I can take the picture.
I can only see you, Riris.
Oh, the set. You are no longer on the spotlight, so probably change the view to gallery view.
Yeah.
Shall we start, Mbak?
Yes. Okay. Mas Rahmat can help. Can you help counting 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3?
Okay. Okay, everybody. 1, 2, 3.
Click
once again.
Page 2.
1, 2, 3.
Okay.
Okay, that's it.
Next slide.
Thank you.
Do we have next slide?
Yes.
Oh.
In page
Okay. Yeah. Okay,
1,
then thank you, Ivan.
2, 3. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ivan. Now, I would like to ask Ibu Nurul, Dr. Nurul Isnaini, as the coordinator of this course, to give some remarks. Ibu Nurul Isnaini have been with us, Shirin, from the very beginning, so she really follows our discussion. Silahkan, Ibu Nurul, be my guest.
Thank you, Mbak Riris, for the opportunity for me to say a little thing for this, before we close these sessions. I think, first of all, personally and on behalf of our students, as well as on behalf of the head of departments and programs, I would like to extend our deep gratitude and thankfulness for the attendance of Professor Shirin today in our special lecture program. Thank you so much for your very comprehensive and very clear explanations for all of us to understand global governance from feminist perspective. I think Professor Shirin has enriched us, has enlightened us with a deep understanding on global governance and feminist perspective from theories and also praxis in various cases, from ranging from migration and also LGBT. And also it is good that she has explained with a comparative perspective between India and Indonesia, and to some extent with from European perspective, because even though Professor Shirin from India, but I think he has professional experience in a very good higher institutions in one of the very important countries in Europe, that is UK. So I think from the beginning I realized actually that this topic for our session today is a bit hard, yeah, because we talk a little bit more on a feminist perspective that I feel that not all students have a similar interest on this issue or in this perspective, but I think this is a good opportunity for all of us to learn something new, to learn an alternative perspective that can broaden our understanding on global governance. Feminist perspective, I think, as part of critical theory is very important to be learned for all of us to critically understand what is going on actually in our world today, especially regarding to the works of global governance, and especially about the gender inequality and how women, as the majority of our population today, has roles, has aspirations, and also has perspectives on the work that they have been going on. So I think we are very lucky today. Professor Shirin has extended her time with us, sharing her very intensive professional knowledge and understanding on this issue. Thank you so much again, Professor Shirin for your time. And also I would like to thank for Ibu Riris for arranging these special sessions and Human as assistants. Also for the students who have very interesting and important questions, so that our discussions today are very interesting and lively. Well, actually, I personally enjoyed very much our special session today with all of you. Thank you so much. So, Ibu Riris, I think we have official appreciation to Professor Shirin. Could you please help us to Human, especially, to share?
Oh,
Professor Shirin,
that is really nice. Thank you.
It is our
Thank you.
official tradition, yeah, to express our deep appreciation to our guest lecturer. So I hope this can be memorable.
I hope one day I will come in person and meet you all. So that will be nice once this pandemic is over.
Yes, I will send the certificate to your email, Shirin.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Riris. Thank you.
And safe and success with your professions. Thank you. Thank you also, Riris.
Okay.
All the participants.
Yeah.
Time is yours.
Thank you, Ibu Nurul. So I think that's the end of our session today. I just want to again say thank you. We learned a lot, and this is I mean, you know, the way you ask question, the way you answer, the way you ask question, the way you answer our question. I think we learned a lot, not only from what you said, but from the whole process. So I hope this is not the end of our learning process together. So please do consider to come to Indonesia when time is good after the pandemic. And yes, we'd love that if we can do some research together. Okay.
Thank you, Iris.
And thank
Bye.
you everyone. Thank you
you.
everyone for coming. Really appreciate your time. It's nearly time 1 hour now before we break our fast. And really appreciate. Yeah. So they're still there now. It's really good. Okay. Thank you everyone. See you.
Bye.
Allow me to close the session. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Mas Arif. I also forget.